Guys, thank you all so much for being here. So my name's Ruth and I'm your secretary. Just before we begin the interview, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Praise Elite Award, which is the award that Mr. Sopel has very deservedly won today. So the Law Society was founded in 1933, and for the past 88 years, we have strived to provide our members with opportunities to socialise, to experience new phenomena, and to engage in discourse. And the Praise Elite Award is an integral part of this endeavour. So it was founded by former President of Ireland and former Auditor of the Law Society, Miss Mary Robinson. And recipients include Sir Bob Geldof, Mr. Jeremy Paxman, Miss Gloria Allred, to name but a few. This year, the Law Society wished to place a particular emphasis on those who empowered students not only in their careers and inspired students not only in their careers but in their everyday lives. And so it is for this reason and more that Mr. Jon Sopel has won the Praise Elite Award today. As you all know, Mr. Sopel is a British journalist, TV presenter and former lead correspondent on BBC News. Particularly amongst this generation, Mr. Sopel is known for his time as the Washington correspondent BBC News during the infamous President Trump, the Donald Trump presidency. And throughout this, he became one of the most respected and acclaimed journalists, definitely for our generation, which is why we nominated him for the Praise Elite Award today. So it is my absolute honour to be presenting Mr. Sopel with the Praise Elite Award, and maybe you'll join me in another round of applause, very deserved round of applause. There we go now. On behalf of us, I really want to get a little photo for Connor. Excellent. Perfect. I'll follow Connor's cue in terms of photos. Anyway, would you like to say a few words of acceptance, actually, before we...
Thank you so much for inviting me and bestowing this wonderful honour. And I kind of looked, as Ruth has said, the list of names who've gone before me, and I thought you must have made some mistake about who I am, that you thought I was worthy recipient of it. I'm incredibly grateful. I'm delighted to be in Dublin. I gather that the sun always shines like this in Dublin, which is great to be here when the sun is shining. And I'm delighted to be at Trinity, so thank you very much indeed for the welcome and the warmth of the welcome. Yeah. Lovely to speak to you all.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, thank you so much for accepting our award and joining us. Obviously, the point of these discussions is, our members choose people who inspire them. So I suppose just before we get into your glittering career, it'd be nice just to ground a little bit and start with, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about how you grew up in North London and maybe your time in college. Given that we are all college students here.
Okay, so I grew up in North London. I was in a house that listened to the radio a great deal. So the Today programme on Radio 4 would always be on in the morning, and so that kind of gave me an awareness of current affairs. I remember vividly, I think I must have been about 12, and there was a discussion on the radio about VD. Venereal disease, and they were talking about VD on the radio, and I said to my mum, "What is VD?" It's an STD, and it was like she'd been waiting for ages to lecture me on the birds and the bees, and I just thought, I wish I hadn't asked that question. I just want to go and play football in the playground before assembly, and so I grew up with that sort of environment of news, and then when I was about 15 or 16, I met someone and her dad was involved in politics, and he was a senior cabinet minister in the Callaghan government back in the 70s in London. And I kind of got a fascination for politics. Not just the ideas, but the practicalities as well about the way politics works. And then I went to university, and I didn't have as much champagne or as big houses as you clearly have at Trinity, as seen by normal people, but we got by, and I became president of the Students' Union, and a friend of mine who I'd graduated with, who is still my closest friend, he went off to journalism college, and it was at the time when the Falklands War was about to start, and Britain was assembling its naval fleet in this kind of, it was almost like a post-imperial spasm of sailing to the South Atlantic. And he was doing at journalism college, and he was down at Portsmouth at the harbour there, interviewing all the sailors before they got on the ships. I thought, God, that looks like an exciting career.
Okay.
maybe I could become a journalist as well. And so that was the spark, thinking, and then I started in local radio. And I just thought, you know what? I'm a square peg in a square hole. I love the life. I still do. I kind of always thought that a journalistic career was quite fun, and it has been. Some bumpy bits as well, and some horrid bits as well, where I've been in, ugly, dangerous places at dangerous times. But although I've been a journalist now for nearly 4 decades, I have never felt there has been a more important time than now to being a journalist, because of all the falsehood and fakery that is out there, that I think is really dangerous to the society that we've grown up in.
Yeah. And actually, as you're talking about the falsehood and fakery and the current times, I suppose that brings us to what maybe a lot of us here kind of know your work for, Mr. Sopel, which is you were the BBC Washington correspondent throughout Donald Trump's presidency. So I guess, what was that like?
I was asked, I did a talk at a literary festival, and this guy stood up and asked the question, who was a student, who was the president of his student union, and he said, what can you tell me, what did you learn from when you were president of your student union that has been helpful now that you are the North America editor and Donald Trump is president? I said, there's nothing in my 35 years of being a journalist that prepared me for Donald Trump as being president. The first presidential news conference that he gave, which in the East Room of the White House, which I was at, and I managed to get a seat on the aisle. I thought, I want to get a seat on the aisle because then I'll get a good eye line, and hopefully I'll be able to ask a question. So my hand goes up, and sure enough. And I barely uttered a syllable. Where are you from? And I go, BBC News. Another beauty. And I go, well, we're impartial, free and fair. And he goes, yeah, like CNN. And I'm suddenly bantering with the President of the United States of America, which seemed a rather odd thing to be doing. And then him having quite a back and forth, where he said, I was trying to ask my question, and he kind of was trying to bat it away. And I said, I haven't finished. He said, stop, I know who you are. And I suddenly got a text from my kid saying, he knows who you are. And so it was a daily ride of total madness. It was exhilarating, it was exhausting, it was unpredictable, you didn't know what would happen next. He was narcissistic, he was obsessed by being the headline in the news the whole time. And if the spotlight wasn't on him, he wanted to know why. And so even on days when there were no news, he would do something to create news. But along with it, he would call us fake news. He would call us the most dishonest people that had ever walked the face of the earth. He called us the enemies of the people, which if you go back to Stalinist Russia, being decreed an enemy of the people, carried with it, you were off to Siberia and the salt mines. And so it was a pretty troubling time to be a journalist. But it seemed to me really important that we were trying to cut through. And I think that American media, I know that there's at least one American in the room, I think American media made a fatal mistake to either say, we are the friend of Donald Trump and we're going to support him, or we are the enemy of Donald Trump, in which case we're just going to lambast him. And I think that there is a real need at the moment for responsible journalism, which is just going to be fair and balanced and hold people to account, and not say on the one hand, on the other. But if we were confronted with it, the novelty of the situation of this president on day one, when Donald Trump said the crowd for my inauguration was the biggest in American history, and it wasn't. Barack Obama's first inauguration had a way bigger crowd. And you just had to say, that is not true. Not on the one hand, on the other. You just had to call it. And so I believe in impartiality in our journalism, but it still can be punchy, still can be aggressive, because there is such a thing as truth.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think we should call that out.
Yeah, no, 100%. And actually, just on that point of fake news, I suppose, do you think that this whole idea of fake news is kind of a buzzword that Donald Trump brought in, I suppose. Was that something that you, as a journalist, were perceptive of in America before the Trump presidency, or is it something that kind of Trump created a hysteria around?
Look, politicians down the ages, when they don't like something you've broadcast or written, will say that's not fair or that's not right or whatever. But Donald Trump, anything that he found disobliging, he would say it's fake news.
Yeah.
And it wasn't fake news.
Yeah.
And there was a huge, sometimes the lies or the fibs or whatever, however you want to class it, the untruths, could be harmless. They were just, he came over to London in 2018. Theresa May was the Prime Minister. He does a news conference and he started talking about Brexit. He said, well, the day before Britain voted for Brexit, I gave a news conference at my golf course at Turnberry in Scotland, where I said to all the journalists, and they didn't believe me, I said to all the journalists, Britain is going to vote for Brexit. And they said, well, what? And the next day I was proved right. Well, I was at that news conference. It took place the day after Brexit, and he hadn't predicted anything. And so I tweeted something about how weird he said this. And then his press secretary, who had been on the trip, so she's paid for by the American taxpayer, said, yes, he was. And I said, Stephanie, this is all on Twitter, the exchange can be found, that's not true. Look, this is what he tweeted. Just arrived in Scotland, place going mad, Britain had voted for Brexit. You arrived on the 24th of June, not the day before Brexit. And it's a kind of pointless lie. But what I found really alarming about it was that you had officials who should know better, who were perpetuating a falsehood, which you can demonstrate empirically to be untrue.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it was harmless, but then you get to the end of Donald Trump's term. He loses the election. This isn't me saying he lost the election, it is every piece of evidence. He lost it by 8 million votes. He lost in Pennsylvania, he lost in Michigan, he lost in Wisconsin, he lost in Arizona, and he lost in Georgia. And there have been recounts galore. He challenged that, that's fine, all within the law. He then tried to strong-arm people, but he says it, but because he was so persuasive, and there was people who were so devoted to him, there are still, roughly speaking, 50 to 60% of Republicans who voted for Donald Trump at the presidential election in November 2020 who still believe that Joe Biden is not there as the legitimate president of the United States. That is scary. Now, the good news is the number is declining because there is no evidence. No evidence has been provided. The election was seen as safe by Trump's Attorney General, who he appointed, who is a staunch Republican, by the head of election security, by the 62 court cases that were brought against the election results, which were all thrown out of court, by the 50 secretaries of state from each of the states who've certified the results. And yet there are still millions of people who believe Donald Trump. Now, I think that journalism has a hell of a responsibility there, because on the 6th of January last year, when there was the attempted insurrection at the Capitol, American democracy teetered on the edge. I went on the 10 o'clock news that night, and the result had not been certified of Joe Biden's victory because the mob was in control of Congress.
Yeah.
And personally, I kind of like, I don't think that Irish society is perfect. I don't think American society is perfect. And I don't think British society is perfect. But I quite like the fact that we have free and fair elections. I quite like the fact that we have free speech. I quite like the fact that we have the rule of law and that, all of that goes with living in a liberal democracy.
Absolutely.
I think is bloody marvellous.
Absolutely.
And I think that my job to say this is false, this is untrue, has never been more important, because I don't care whether you vote for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or Sinn Féin. I don't care whether you vote for Brexit or against Brexit. I don't care whether you vote Republican or Democrat. But I do care that when you go into the polling station to vote, your vote is based on good information, not something that an algorithm has thrown up on Facebook or wherever it happens to be, or something that is malicious falsehood, which we've seen a huge amount of, generated by bad actors who want to. And I think that if we want to live in a society where we can say what the hell we like, vote how we like, dress how we like, then it's really important to counter that. And if January the 6th was a warning shot, or kind of I mean, what's happening now in Ukraine, where all these people in Russia are only being fed a diet of propaganda, and there are no checks and balances on any of it, that's the screaming alarm. And it's like, you know, what nearly happened in America on January the 6th, I'm not saying that, you know, Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin, although there are times when you felt Donald Trump really wanted to be Vladimir Putin. That I think that you do need to have a media that is critical, that holds people in power to account, and that does a job like that.
Absolutely. And so, would you think, given, you know, that there are still people in America who don't see Biden as their rightful president, that, you know, we saw the insurrection happen, and just the kind of lasting impacts, I suppose, of the Trump presidency, would you think that all these things did emerge because of Donald Trump being president, or were there ingredients? Is this the impact of Trump, or was that all kind of bubbling beneath the surface beforehand?
It's a great question. I think that, look, Trumpism, if it hadn't been Trump, I suspect that there was the public were in the market for something that would be a disruptor. And I think that is true of Brexit, and I think it's true of Trump, and I think it's true of a lot of elections that have taken place. I mean, even when people were celebrating the normality of France voting for Macron at the last presidential election, that was disruptive because it was not a convention. You know, the French Fifth Republic has always been someone from the left or someone from the right, not a centrist like Macron, not someone as young as Macron. So I think that people, after the global recession after 2008 and the subprime crisis and the housing crisis, all the rest of it, I think people were expecting it to be like other recessions, where you just waited a few months and your shuttered factory would reopen and the jobs would come flying back. And the jobs were lost for good, and I think that people felt that conventional politics had let them down, that globalization had let them down, that in America I think there was a backlash of having 8 years of a liberal president, of Barack Obama, of, you know, a black president, of gay rights, of all these things, and that there was just this kind of, and Donald Trump, you know, I remember being in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and this woman, I said, what do you like about Donald Trump? She goes, I love your accent. And I said, well, I love yours too, madam. And she said, well, I love that Donald Trump. He says what I'm thinking, and I'm not allowed to say it. Sorry, was that a terrible one? Was that right?
You've got an approval.
Good. And that's exactly it. Donald Trump was politically incorrect. He he pressed some buttons which, you know, just might attract people who were maybe a little bit racist or a little bit sexist or a little bit, you know, and Donald Trump was never treated like a conventional politician. Yeah. So the rules that would apply to a Joe Biden or, you know, Jeb Bush or whoever else just didn't apply to him. And he was able to get away with stuff that no other normal politician would. Yeah. And the more that journalists attacked him, the more he would say, look, it's the Washington elite, they don't like me. And he played it brilliantly. And I also have to say that Hillary Clinton in 2016 was an absolutely hopeless candidate. I mean, there was misogyny, no doubt about it. The email investigation that the head of the FBI launched 11 days before election day had an impact. But Donald Trump had, you might not like the messages about, you know, we're going to build a wall, we're going to ban Muslims from coming into the country, we're going to renegotiate trade deals, we're going to look after our vets. His messages were crystal clear. And he brought a lot of people out to vote who'd never previously voted.
Yeah.
And but for COVID, he would have won in 2020. I'm convinced of it. Because, I think he just handled it so badly. So I don't think people voted for Biden because they thought, oh my God, look at this inspirational man, this wonderful orator.
It's wave of change.
Has anyone ever tried to stay awake through a Joe Biden news conference? It's tough going. And it was but he seemed sane, and he seemed reasonable, and he seemed calm, and he seemed measured, and he was going to be rational. And I think there was just a huge anti-Trump backlash. And that's what cost Trump the election. If the economy had been powering on uninterrupted, and the fact that Joe Biden didn't do rallies and stayed in his basement in Wilmington, Delaware, and keeping a mask on at all times, it suited Biden. Biden wouldn't have been able to do the rallies that Trump did. Biden's, awful on those big stages. Whereas Trump is brilliant. He's very, very entertaining. It's great being at a Trump rally. I mean, I've been to too many of them to list, but they are entertaining. And the other thing about Trump was, which is why the TV cameras, when they had the opportunity, always stuck with Trump, because Trump had jeopardy. You didn't know what was going to happen next. You didn't know who he was going to attack. You didn't know who he was going to round on. And so you thought, Christ, I'm going to... would I rather take Trump, or would I take Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz? Give me Trump every time.
Okay, interesting. And so if that's the case, but for COVID, we might have had a different outcome, do you think Trump 2024 is on the horizon?
It's perfectly possible. I think the problem that, there was this kind of glib phrase that went around in Washington in 2016 when Trump won the election, that the presidency will change Donald Trump. Donald Trump won't change the presidency. Wrong. Donald Trump changed the presidency.
Okay.
And I think the problem, I don't think Donald Trump is capable of change. And at the moment, he's still banging on about why he lost in 2020 and the rigged election and the big lie. It's all bullshit. He didn't, he lost the election. But the more he goes on about it, and I was with a pollster who's done a lot of work in UK politics, very smart guy, who said, if you are framing your argument for re-election about something that happened in the past, you're going to lose.
Okay.
So unless Trump can get over it and stop talking about how badly the rioters of January the 6th have been treated and how he was robbed of election victory, then I don't see how he wins over enough Americans.
Okay.
Because I think the coalition of, he lost in 2020 because white college-educated women that had been with him in 2016 voted Democrat. A lot of people living in the suburbs voted Democrat. Independents voted Democrat. Moderate Republicans voted Democrat. And I think that also the war in Ukraine, and I hate to talk about it in narrow political terms because it is so grotesque what is unfolding and a humanitarian catastrophe and, just something I never thought I would see happen in my lifetime. War in Europe, that seemed to belong to the history books. I think Trump's record with this sort of weird, adoration is not the right word, but the fating of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And I was at the news conference that Trump gave with Putin in Helsinki when they had this summit. It was the weirdest thing ever, where Trump is so much enthralled to Putin, and you just thought, there's something weird going on here. I think it's probably no more complicated than, there are a lot of conspiracy theories, and there was there was the dossier that was compiled about, that Russia had compromising pictures of Donald Trump and prostitutes and urinating on mattresses or something. I won't go into the sordid details. I don't think that's necessarily, I don't think that's true. But I think that Trump just loves the strongman. And you cannot find a quote where Trump is critical of Putin, even now, saying he's a strategic genius, it's terrible happening, but look, what a smart guy. And I think that is, I think that could cost Trump as well in 2024. And there are legal problems, and there are all sorts of problems. Yeah.
Many obstacles to that one. But actually, just as you're talking about leaders and the dynamics between leaders there, I do want to come back to the Biden presidency a little bit.
Yeah.
But do you think that the dynamics between leaders affect the political climate? I mean, obviously, when you were Washington correspondent, Trump had Theresa May and Boris Johnson, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so currently Biden is interacting with Putin. If it were Donald Trump and Putin, would we be seeing a different scenario on our hands? Did Trump respond differently to the different PMs? What do you think? How do you think those dynamics affect translate into our everyday lives, I guess?
Yeah, you've got broadly two views of history, haven't you?
Yeah.
The view of history that certain things happen because of inevitability. The Marxist analysis of history is a deterministic history. It's the clash of capital and labour, and eventually, communism will happen because it's the only natural thing that can emerge out of it. And that individuals play no role. There are greater tectonic plates that are moving. I think that the impact of individuals is huge. I mean, 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, we thought Zelensky was a bit of a joke as the president of Ukraine. He has galvanized the nation and he's making a huge difference. If Donald Trump were president now of the United States of America and Putin had done what he'd done, I think Trump would have said to the American people, none of our business. None of our business. There wouldn't be the sanctions in place. There wouldn't be, and I think Ukraine would be in a much more precarious position than it is now. Now, Trump would say, well, Vladimir Putin wouldn't have dared do that if I'd been president. I'm going to say that there's, Putin hasn't been scared by very much at all. Yeah. And the chaos of the West and the disorganisation of the West and the dissent within the European Union and the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the chaotic, shambolic withdrawal that Biden ordered, I think it all gave Putin a sense that the West are so self-obsessed, are so gazing at their own navels that they won't do anything. And I think he's miscalculated spectacularly. Yeah. Because I think that you've seen Europe much more united. You've seen Ukraine showing that, my God, has it got a national identity, that people are prepared to die in the last ditch to defend their country. He wanted NATO further away from Russia's border. He's now got more NATO even closer. Yeah. So on every level, now that doesn't mean it ends well. I don't think Putin's going to suddenly say, oh shit, this is all going horribly wrong. We're going out. I think it's going to end horribly. But I don't think Putin is going to achieve. I mean, he wanted a blitzkrieg victory that, Kiev would fall within 2 or 3 days and they'd go home again. Yeah. And you've got a ton of Russian armour sitting there without any fuel. Yeah. So it's a mess.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, talking about Ukraine and talking about President Biden there a little bit, I suppose that would be perceived as one of his major obstacles now. They're coming up to midterm elections in the US, and his kind of interplay with the war that's ongoing could put potentially the Democrats in a rough position when coming up to the midterm elections. Would you perceive that as an obstacle for President Biden, or what obstacles do you think are kind of before him in his presidency or now?
So I think that when it comes to, so the midterm elections are in November. Yeah. I mean, America is always on a permanent election footing. You get rid of one and you're on to the next. In terms of foreign policy, a US president has much more latitude to do what he wants than if it was domestic policy, where you would need to get congressional approval a lot in American politics, the way the Constitution is framed. And I remember when I was a student, it was always said that the American president could run a small war without ever having to speak to Congress for approval. And I think that actually on Ukraine there is bipartisan support, so that is not going to hobble Biden. And so far, I mean, I've been pretty critical of. I mean, I thought that the kind of the withdrawal from Afghanistan was just shameful and appalling and ill-judged, and it just not just the policy being wrong, which I kind of thought it was sort of, but also the execution of the policy was so woeful. Saying we're going to have all American troops out by September the 11th, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and you just thought, well, you've just set an arbitrary deadline which is going to empower the Taliban to think, you're on our way out, we'll hurry them out. And so I've been very critical of Biden. I think over Ukraine, actually the sanctions that have been put in place, the unity and repurposing of NATO, the working with the European Union has been pretty impressive. And I think that Biden is desperately difficult balance between show you're really tough on the Kremlin, but don't start World War III.
Yeah.
And it's bloody scary at the moment. I mean, this is, I'm 62 years old. I was a tiny kid when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, but this is serious stuff. And, one missile misses its target and lands in a NATO country. NATO has to respond. NATO is busy rearming the Ukrainians. Does Vladimir Putin think I can take out the supply lines? And, a miscalculation that could lead to escalation is serious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you're talking there about kind of how Biden does have to play the field a little bit and showing that he's tough on the Kremlin, but not quite launching World War III. But if push came to shove, do you think America would be in the position to be the superpower that we kind of perceive them as having been throughout history thus far, when it came to wars? Or is it time for somebody else to...
Well, I mean, look, it's not... There was this wonderful theory, I mean, about 30 years ago, that we'd reached the end of history, and that it was when the Iron Curtain came down, it was the triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism, and everyone was going to live happily ever after, and that was the end of it. And it just hasn't been like that. And I think it's more complicated than that. At that stage, 30 years ago, it was a unipolar world. America was the only superpower. Well, you've now got Russia that has got, it may not be an economic superpower, but it's got an awful lot of nuclear weapons to disrupt the world enormously. And you've got China. I think for a peaceful end, it will require China to say to Russia, enough.
And do you think China will?
No, not yet. I think that China will feel that whatever its own ambitions were have been complicated by Russia's ham-fisted and brutal assault on Ukraine, and it's kind of, both Russia and China had a vested interest in undermining American hegemony.
Yeah.
And I think that has been made more difficult by what's happened. But I think that, and America is frustrated as well. Why is it always us that has to be if Europe, why haven't you spent more on defence? Why is it always us that has to ride to the rescue?
Yeah.
And Europe, you've been talking about defence for bloody years, but haven't been paying your bill. And I think that's where Trump was absolutely on the money when he talked about how, the NATO countries needed to stump up more cash. Otherwise, America might, withdraw from the treaty. I think that, but when you say when push comes to shove, I don't think that if Putin oversteps and goes into a NATO country, America could do anything other than act. Because I think then you've given up, and then you are going back to the Cold War, where, that was envisioned in the Yalta Agreement, where you've got spheres of influence, where the world is carved up, and, whether you're from the Baltic states, you're from Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, that becomes part of the Russian Empire again. And so I do think there are big issues at stake here.
No, 100%. And even then just when you're saying, there is that kind of groundswell of, well, why does it always have to be us getting involved? Maybe coming from the American people, perhaps, like the voters. Do you think that as they watch Biden kind of try to respond to the situation in Ukraine, do you think that is going to impact the midterm elections for Biden and for the Democrats?
Don't know, it depends how it goes. I mean, I think that if Americans at the moment would be much more concerned, I suspect, and I'm not living there at the moment, so I'm not following the news. But the fact that fuel, gas, is $4.20 a gallon is horrifying to most Americans who, are used to it being under, when I was there, it was $2.80 and it's gone up steeply.
Yeah.
And that will affect more American lives than I think the crisis that's unfolding in Ukraine, which will seem a long way away from home. Mm-hmm. So I think there are domestic concerns that will affect the midterm elections. But if Biden, this week in America, on the Hill, they're starting hearings for Biden's pick for the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Now, if she becomes Supreme Court Justice, that doesn't affect the balance of the court. The balance of the court is still pretty conservative. But if Biden has done well, and you get the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court, then maybe that will encourage African-Americans to go out to vote who've been a bit disillusioned by Biden in greater numbers in the midterms. Mm-hmm. But, Biden at the moment is at like 41-42% favourability rating.
Yeah.
The last president who managed to hold on to the House and the Senate in the midterms, which was George W. Bush after the 2001 attack, so in the 2002 midterm elections, his approval rating was like at 65%.
Yeah.
So Biden is way off if the Dems are going to hold the House and the Senate. So governing will become undoubtedly more difficult. I mean, legislatively, America will grind to a halt.
Absolutely.
Because there's nothing that Biden will be able to get through if he loses in the midterm in November.
Yeah. And do you think that is symptomatic of the system that they have in America? I mean, you had said at the beginning, there's always elections and there is, things change quite often. The voters have a chance to respond to what they're seeing quite often. And I suppose that feeds into what kind of media are they being fed around the time? There's a lot of dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, America is. Do I think the system is? I mean, there are some. Yeah, exactly. There are some structural problems about American election systems, which is just bewildering. That there was a case that went before the Supreme Court called Citizens United, which means that there is unlimited funds that you can spend on election campaigns. So it is an arms race, and the millions that are spent on these ghastly attack ads that, if I was wealthy living in one of those swing districts, I would just be out of the state for the whole period of the election, so I didn't have to listen to the endless diatribe of attack ads. That's so bloody tedious. I think that there is, and some of the changes that Republicans are making as a result of Donald Trump making accusations that the election was stolen, that are going to disproportionately affect minority voters who tend to vote Democrat.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to suppress turnout among an awful lot of in an awful lot of areas, which would be strong Democratic areas. Those are all things that structurally you think are terrible. But America is vibrant. It's fabulous. There's an awful lot that I absolutely love about America. Yeah. And I kind of think that I think there comes a moment in history where you think, well, whose side am I on? And I kind of think, would you rather be living in Moscow?
Yeah.
Or would you rather be living in America? I don't know what my answer is to that. Yeah. And I think that, for all the faults of Western society, we're not living in what is essentially an autocratic, totalitarian state where if you make any criticism now, you're arrested, any free newspapers are closed down,
Yeah.
The media is having to, did you see the woman who held up the sign on Russian television? And she's now been accused of being a British spy.
Yeah.
As an act of spycraft, I'd say holding up a protest is going to expose yourself as an MI6 agent pretty quickly, which, if you went to spy school, would probably tell you that's not the best thing to do.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's what the Russians are now saying. And, and clearly they're saying it in the hope that people will believe this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's kind of scary.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
God, I'm sounding bloody gloomy, aren't I?
No.
Jeez, let's ask some funny questions.
No, we were saying America is nice and vibrant.
No,
we were picking up. Yeah, we're picking up the mood. No, but actually, I do want to give people a chance to ask you some of their own questions. So, I could talk to you for hours on this topic, but I will just maybe move on slightly as we just come towards the end and ask. You're right. There's so much politics at the moment to report on. There's so much going on. Have you got anything exciting coming up next? Do you see yourself staying in the game a lot longer to continue?
Well, it was announced
Yes.
3 or 4 weeks ago that I'm leaving the BBC after 1,000,000 years. And,
Exactly, yeah.
And the podcast, Americast, that I did with Emily Maitlis, we are now going to be starting a daily podcast for a rival concern, which is incredibly exciting. When does it start? Wish I could answer that. I don't know. Essentially, I'm hoping that we might be on air, and it will be on the global player, but it will be available on wherever you get your podcasts, hopefully from mid-May, if we can recruit the production staff that we need. Otherwise, it's probably not going to start until September the 1st. Okay. And the thing that has been kind of amazing to me and revelatory, and I say this as someone who's in the BBC, everything is driven by what's on the 10 o'clock news and what's on the Radio 4 morning programme, the Today programme. And I suddenly realised over the last year that whenever I engage with kind of you sort of guys, everyone knows the podcast. And podcasting has got so much more immediacy, intimacy. It's more interesting way of listening to it than a pre-packaged program. And so when I got this offer to kind of do a daily podcast and to do it with Emily Maitlis, who is the one, if you don't know her, she's a superb journalist and brilliant presenter. And she did the Prince Andrew interview that was just, oh God, what a gift. It just seems so exciting. And, so I'm not going to be on the TV as much, but I'm going to be doing this podcast. And I think it's great. And I think it's a really interesting way of reaching people. And I think it is the future. And I think that, if I get stopped on the street by people who've seen me on the 10 o'clock news, they're older than I am. Because you just look at the audience figures, for who is watching a conventionally built news programme. Wow. The demographic is old people, and it's not young. And so to be doing this in this space seems really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've loads of subscribers here to your podcast.
Good.
Yes.
Spread the word.
Absolutely, leave it to us. But I suppose then, just before I'll let you all ask questions. But just before we move that, do you have any imparting words of wisdom? I mean, there might be some future podcasters, some future broadcasters in our midst who may have inspired some people to, aspire for a North American editor. Do you have any just imparting words of wisdom or advice?
God, I don't have words of wisdom. No, I think that I bet you'll all do stunningly well. You're bright, you've got brains, you've got charm, you've got all the capabilities. There are going to be times when it's going to get shitty and you're going to have setbacks and your career ain't going to go at the speed you want it to go or in the direction you want it to go. And you've got to have resilience and you've got to be tough and you've got to take setbacks but you've got to have belief. And you've got to have it inside you that you can do this thing. Don't be delusional. Don't for a long time I wanted to play for Tottenham Hotspur, and it didn't happen, and I don't think now it is going to happen. I think I've finally come to
Manifest that.
I think I've finally come to accept that I'm not going to replace Harry Kane. But I think that, and the other great piece of advice that was given to me, there are two great pieces of advice. One which was good for the BBC. The first piece of advice was, if you want to make God laugh, tell him you've got a plan. And I think that people can be too deterministic about where they think their career should be after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years. You know, I didn't know I was going to get, you know, I spent 4 years in Paris. I didn't expect to become Paris correspondent. Yeah. And I thought my chance of going to Washington had passed, and then suddenly they say to me, do you want to go? Well, yeah, it's not really convenient right now. Well, tough. It may not be convenient right now, but these opportunities, be flexible. Yeah. And go with opportunities when they come along and take them. The other great piece of advice was the Chinese proverb, which is great for a BBC career, because it's so Machiavellian and so kind of, which was the Chinese proverb that if you stand by the riverbank long enough, the body of your enemy will eventually float past. There are times in your career where there's going to be someone who is blocking you, who is determined to put you down, and who's determined to kind of thwart you in your ambitions. And just wait them out, because their body will eventually float by. There you are.
Excellent.
That's my wisdom.
I feel much wiser now, absolutely inspired. Well, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? If you want to just like put up your hand and I can pick you out of the... I saw Louise's hand go up first. I'm going to head straight to Miss Cullen. Yes.
Hi, thank you. That was a really great talk. I guess I'm just wondering, like, you were talking about media in America and how it's very divided. Like, do you think that the American media system is broken, and if so, is it broken beyond repair? Like, can it be fixed?
I think it's pretty damaged, but I don't think it's broken beyond repair. I mean, CNN, you know, when I went out to America, and you know, I was there for the last 2 years of Obama, it just felt like a kind of a bit more liberal version of the BBC, but it didn't. But unfortunately, they saw it. It wasn't just that the presenters hated Donald Trump, though they probably did. It was that it became a business model. The business model came to be, right, Fox, Newsmax, and One American News Networks and the Shock Jock have got the pro-Trump corner of the market. We need to be the most anti-Trump corner of the market to get that. And I think that led to such a polarisation that no Republican would ever listen to CNN or another network called MSNBC, and no Democrat would ever listen to Fox or One American News Network or Newsmax. Because people started to think of news as something that wasn't about, they weren't informed, they were affirmed. You went to it to have your views reaffirmed of what to believe. And I think that's really dangerous, because I think sometimes truth is uncomfortable. You know, sometimes people that you love or loathe as politicians, you know, someone you love does something terrible, and the journalist has to say that was terrible. And sometimes someone you loathe does something brilliant, and you need to say that was pretty impressive. And I think that whether in universities or wherever we are in life, you need to listen to unpopular opinions and listen to arguments and come to a judgment. And that's all I ask. Is, as I said, I think earlier on, I don't care how you vote, but I want you to vote based on some good information, not because you've been given propaganda. And I think that so the American media system is not irredeemably bust, and the US networks do try to play it fairly straight. But I think everyone is so polarised in America on everything. You know, just to give a quick example, you know, the COVID Act, mask wearing is political. There was a governor's race in Virginia where the Democrat candidate was 14 points ahead in the poll among those people who had been vaccinated. 70 to 80% of Virginians had been vaccinated. So you kind of thought, well, this guy's going to win the race. The Republican won it, because everyone who was unvaccinated voted Republican. Now, we've got our problems in Britain, and we've got our problems in France, and we've got our problems probably in Ireland too, about, mask wearing, but it's not an indicator of how you're going to vote.
Yeah.
And in America it is. And so that is part of the polarity. And then you've got your audience, and you feed them more doubts about mask wearing, or because that is good for business. And so I think that news in America needs to rediscover some of the traditional values. And there were odd things like the New York Times comment editor was forced to resign because he'd commissioned an opinion piece from a Republican senator, Tom Cotton, from Arkansas, I think. Now, you're my fact checker. You didn't know you had the role. You didn't know you had the role of fact checker, but you did. And how crazy is that? That the New York Times comment editor had to resign because he'd commissioned a piece from a Republican. I mean, my God, have we not grown up enough that we can listen to alternate viewpoints? So I kind of think that that's something that America needs to sort out.
Yeah. Thanks, Louise. Has anybody else got any questions? Oh, we've loads. We'll go. I saw for
as Louise mentioned, and you mentioned monetization of news networks in America, does that necessarily, then the counter argument would be that if you have a state-run news media that's going to view the voices of the state, so what would you see be better, the BBC or the US's system?
Well, I'd qualify that. It's a great question. I'd qualify that to say that, well, one, the BBC is not state-run. I mean, it gets licence-payer funding, but I think Boris Johnson would love it to be much more sympathetic to the government than it is, and it isn't. And Labour Prime Ministers have also wished. But you can have a requirement for impartiality, and so in the British, I mean, the ecosystem of British broadcasting is bigger than the BBC. It's ITV, it's Sky News, it's other players, global, which is where I'm going to go to. There is still the same impartiality. Sky is not monetising pro or anti-Boris sentiment, neither is ITV. And I just think that in a newspaper, it's much easier to differentiate between what is news and what is comment. You can have a banner saying comment pages, whereas if you just happen to be tuning in to a TV station and you don't know the difference between comment and news, it's very much harder to distinguish. And therefore, I'd say that the British model, and that's not being state-run, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the Irish system, which has got RTE as the big player, but there are other networks as well, you haven't got that same partisan voices that you do in American television, which are just so damaging.
There was one more question, so yes, absolutely.
Hi, thank you for this excellent but my question is about, given what we've seen in the last few years with regards to voter suppression, with regards to gerrymandering, with regards to propaganda, particularly in the last administration, the relationship between propaganda and the executive branch of government, do you think it is still accurate to call the US a liberal democracy? And if not, do you think there is a better term that you can use to describe it?
Great question. I would still call it a liberal democracy, but there are going to be a couple of qualifications here. The fact of the matter is that what happened on January the 6th did not show the strength of the US Constitution, which is a brilliant document and brilliantly written about the three co-equal branches of government, etc., etc., etc. I think it showed the brittleness, and that had Trump been more disciplined and better organised, he probably would have got the election overturned, and there would have been an illegitimate president in the White House now. And I think the fragility is there and needs to be taken seriously And I think it is a wake-up call that what happened on January the 6th shows that American democracy is not permanent, and that if you look at the arc of history, you know, liberal democracy isn't the norm. We have grown up in a societies without war, where governments change colour. We don't like the government, we kick them out, we put another government in, we think they're crap too, so we kick them out, and so the circle goes on. And we have free speech, and we can protest, and we can shout, and we can scream, and we can argue and canvass people to vote against this one and vote for that one. And it's not perfect, but it is liberal democracy, and I think that you know, I think in 2016, the people got what they wanted. Okay, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes, but Donald Trump played by the rules of the Electoral College and won. I think in 2008 and 2012, America wanted change and they wanted Obama and they got what they wanted. That seems to me democracy working. In 2020, they got what they wanted, but it came close. So I think America is still a liberal democracy, but I don't think there is any room for complacency. And I think that it looks normal now in America, but I still think there is danger that can't be ignored, and that America could easily go down a different path that would take it away from what has been its rich and glorious history of democracy for 200 plus years.
Fantastic. Guys, thank you so much for